Good evening and welcome to Our Front Porch, our ongoing series where you get to ask the questions of some of our local experts. Hi, Larry.
Hi there.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Welcome to Our Front Porch. Larry, I was thinking about this and I am so glad that you came up with this idea. It kind of jump-started our whole virtual program, get back in the swing of things thing.
I'm very glad I could be of assistance.
You've been a great assistant.
I'm sure it was inadvertent.
Well, I kind of roped you in, and then I made you do all the work, right?
It's fine.
But yeah, you put together quite a good roster of people like Richard to bring on topics of their expertise that we can kind of delve into some questions. Just like you do on any front porch, you pose questions, have a good conversation, and try to figure some things out. So welcome to those of you out there in the virtual world. We have a couple people here with us tonight. So thank you for joining us. We also need to thank the Illinois Humanities Council for their COVID relief grant. That also helps us continue to bring the humanities to our local community and beyond. Because I know we have a couple guests from out of state, so welcome to you too. This is, what is it, the fourth one?
Yeah, it's 4.
And we have another one scheduled for this year, but Richard Hardy, who is scheduled for in 2 weeks, the 16th, has had to cancel. But no worries, we've come up with a replacement, a good replacement, Tim Roberts. So we're going to revisit the Civil War, which is Larry's area. Tim is also really knowledgeable. He brings to it a lot of our local history. He's a member of the museum board. You might have taken a walking tour of the square with him. He also was featured on Illinois Stories with Mark McDonald for that tour. He wrote a book about some letters. He transcribed some letters from 2 Civil War families in the area. So that should be a really interesting conversation. So join us for that, and we'll try to get Richard rescheduled for 2021. So we're not going to let him off the hook.
No.
Okay, good. All right, good. All right, so how's this going to work tonight? Some of you might be regulars, but for those of you that are new, we try to go back and forth with a couple questions from the audience or people who have submitted questions in advance. And for those of you online, you can use that comment section below and ask us questions, and we will pass them to Richard and Larry and try to get a conversation going. Larry has been our trusty facilitator, so we kind of leave him in charge. And if you have any questions or even technical things, also put those in the comments and we'll try to address those too. Again, this is all kind of new. Did I cover everything?
Yep.
You guys ready to go?
Yep.
All right, so let's get started.
Okay. Hi again, and welcome. Welcome back to some of you, and some of you, this might be your first time. My guest tonight, my expert, is Professor Richard Fillipink of the History Department at Western Illinois University. One of the people I hired when I was chair, a wise choice. Rich is our expert in essentially recent 20th century, 21st century U.S. history. He is an author of a book on American presidency and Eisenhower and Kennedy. He is a former, 2 years ago, Hall was lecturer in liberal arts where we talked about Nixon and Kissinger. We have decided to make this topic focus on the Richard Nixon presidency, which of course includes Watergate. Welcome, Rich. How are you doing?
Doing good tonight, Larry.
Anything
Glad to be
you want
here.
to start with?
Well, I think probably I'd start with the bibliography I put up, which Larry thought was too long, but for me is always too short. Nixon is perhaps, out of the American presidents next to Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, the most written about president. And for me, probably the best books, 2 books on Nixon, one Nixon biographically, but in the White House, and the other on his presidency, are on the list, are Rick Perlstein's Nixonland, which is a nice look at Nixon coming into the White House and going out of it in some excellent detail. And Richard Reeves' more personal look at Nixon alone in the White House, which is a little more traditionally biographical, but a biography of his presidency. So two very strong books and 2 very well-written books.
If you were going to pick something on Watergate, what would it be?
I have to go with the classic Stanley Cutler's The Wars of Watergate.
It's huge, but
It's huge.
It's a very interesting read.
But it has to be huge, if you considering the depth of the issues involved. And you can't talk about Watergate without talking about Cutler, because Cutler's lawsuit forcing the Nixon Foundation and the National Archives to open up the tapes, both the rest of the Watergate tapes and the rest of the tapes made by Nixon's presidency, is crucial to our understanding of Nixon and his administration.
Are now all those tapes available?
They are,
Research?
all of the ones that, except for the ones that are deemed as personal or still have classified information, you can find them at the Nixon Library website, or my preferred choice is the Miller Center website from the University of Virginia, which has a special section that has recordings from all of the presidents that undertook recording during the presidency.
This is the Miller Center for Studying the Presidency?
Yes.
Well, let me start with a question for you.
Okay.
If there was a single most important factor in the makeup of Richard Nixon, personality-wise, how do you explain his behavior? Is there such a thing, and what would it be?
There probably is. I think for me, the thing that most defines Nixon is perhaps this sort of endless well of self-pity. Nixon came from a relatively working class background. His father did own a general store where Nixon was expected to do a lot of work. Two of his brothers were seriously ill. His oldest brother died. So Nixon was sort of the co-breadwinner of the family. He would go to market and pick out lettuce and produce for the family store before he went to school every day. And so Nixon really saw himself as this sort of tragic figure who's always put upon, that's surrounded by enemies, and the enemies are so much more powerful than he is, and yet he will have to persevere.
But even though he has enemies and he's an underdog, he wins. I mean, he becomes president, he's elected twice.
But he never sees it as a victory. He even sees, one of the things that was most notable about his re-election, he wins this massive landslide, 61% of the popular vote, crushes George McGovern. And one of the things that even Nixon himself admitted, he just sort of felt kind of melancholy. And he didn't really see it as a victory so much as, I'm going to have to face these problems going forward. And so it was never enough. Even winning the presidency was not enough to make Nixon think of himself as a winner. Throughout his political career, a majority of newspapers and media outlets endorsed him over Kennedy, over Brown, over McGovern, and he always thought that they were all still his enemies, and that everybody was against him, and he was always the one who was put upon.
Well, in one of Nixon's books, his first one, I guess, called Six Crises, which was written about the time he lost the governorship race in '62.
Yep.
Those 6 crises, several of them don't seem like big crises now, do they? I mean, maybe you better go through some of them, what they were.
Comparatively, no. The 4 of the 6 crises, the first one is the Alger Hiss case, which is more of a crisis for Alger Hiss as opposed to Richard Nixon. It propels Nixon into the Senate and into the vice presidency. He has the checkered speech, the fun case where he gets caught, along with Adlai Stevenson, having a slush fund
of $18,000.
Well, it's a lot of money in those days. Then Eisenhower's heart attack and the pressure on him to lead without appearing to seize power. His ill-fated trip to Venezuela, where he's assaulted and nearly killed. The kitchen debate with Khrushchev, which you got to go a long way to elevate that to being a crisis. I guess he really wanted 6, but and then losing to Kennedy. So again, comparatively speaking, at least 2 of these probably aren't crises in the traditional sense, but again, sort of speak to the poor Richard aspect of it, which in fact was the code name for the operation to rescue him from Venezuela.
Right, poor Richard. I'm sure he appreciated that.
Yeah, he was thrilled.
You got anything for us, Sue? Should we just continue?
You can continue. Continue.
Okay. Who was checkers?
checker is a copper spaniel given to me by a donor from Texas for my little girl. By God, we're not going to give it back. Yeah, it's, again, this sort of maudlin, you're right. He has
the president do Zachary Taylor for
I can do Nixon. I can do a little Reagan.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. That's a bonus we got.
But yeah, in case it ever comes up. But yeah, so but really, checker sort of becomes a symbol. It becomes the checker speech because for supporters of Nixon, it's just an example of how the Democrats are unfairly targeting him. And for Nixon's opponents, it's Nixon throwing his family into the line of fire and glossing over a real issue, having this businessman provide a slush fund and turning it into this sort of personal attack.
Was there a real chance that Eisenhower would dump it in 52?
Eisenhower would have done what was best for Eisenhower. One of the things that's forgotten about Eisenhower is that his ego is as large as anybody's. And if he thought Nixon was going to drag him down to defeat, Nixon would have been jettisoned immediately. So Nixon handled himself well, and his ability to sort of steal a march on Eisenhower and pull forward all the support from the Republican committeemen and from many Republican politicians confirmed that he was going to stay on the ticket.
So I recall Eisenhower waited to call Nixon to tell him he was still on the ticket.
Well,
he was my boy.
Yeah, but again, from Eisenhower's point of view, I'm the commander. You are one of my officers. It will happen on my time.
So, Nixon and Eisenhower were never really close, really.
No, in fact, one of the things that happens when Nixon's running in 1960, and they're filming a commercial for him at Eisenhower's ranch. Eisenhower points out, "This is the first time I've ever had him here."
Yeah.
And so they're never close personally. They're never friends. They're in-laws, but they're never friends.
Yes. So,
Is you ready for a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Was there any clear moment in Nixon's life that could have resulted in this thought process of always seeing enemies and never feeling like it was worthy victory? Or was it just Nixon and always had been Nixon?
Is there ever a moment in his life that sort of creates this self-image? That's kind of a tough thing to delve into without being able to talk to Nixon. Some biographers argue that it comes from his family background, that because of the death of his oldest brother and the death of his youngest brother, that Nixon wanted to be three sons at once for his mother, and when he goes to Duke University Law School and sort of interacts with people from the East Coast and from the South for the first time, he sort of feels like he's never an establishment figure, that he's never from the Ivy League. Others argue that this is just sort of Nixon's personality, that he, even when he was in school, he was always the sort of dour, stick in the mud kind of character, and that's how he was throughout his life. And he's sort of the introvert in politics. He's not a typical glad-handing politician. He'll do it, but he doesn't like it. He generally doesn't seem to like being around people.
Yet he was a killer poker player.
Yes.
In fact, he made quite a bit of money in the Navy playing poker.
Arguably, that's how he helped finance his first campaign. It certainly financed a down payment on his first house.
Would you say that maybe what role does Nixon's family religion, Quakerism, play, if any? I don't envision him as a practicing Quaker, but
No.
he grew up in the culture of that.
He did. His grandmother was apparently very disappointed that he joined the Navy. But I don't know enough about his personal religious background to say that his Quakerism shaped him any. I think the sense that his family is a safe haven is clearly something that comes from that kind of background, that his daughters and his wife are the only people he seemed to trust absolutely, and to feel that he could let his hair down in front of. Very rarely is he going to be kind of comfortable and having a talk at a front porch like this with anyone except for his family members.
Maybe B.B. Rebozo?
Well, the story with Rebozo apparently is that Rebozo never said anything. If Nixon wanted to be alone, then with Rebozo he was.
Yeah.
He just paid for things and just hung out with Nixon.
Rebozo was Cuban American.
Yeah.
Wealthy man in Miami buying a beach.
Yeah.
Nixon met before he was president.
Yes, he was introduced. Nixon, one of the things he did share with Eisenhower is had a fair number of well-heeled friends who helped him along financially. Nixon's Key Biscayne house was funded in essentially a questionable real estate deal where Nixon bought shares in this real estate company for $1 a piece and then sold them for $2 a piece to this cadre of wealthy friends.
So Nixon has supporters and loyal advocates, but he lacks close personal friends, somebody he would unburden himself to.
Exactly. He was not a touchy-feely kind of guy. You were a supporter, you were an acquaintance, you were an enemy. You were probably not going to be a friend.
Somebody described Nixon as the kind of nerdy kid who got a briefcase at Christmas time and liked it.
Yep.
Okay. Welcome to briefcase. Also pretty well described to me.
Good briefcases are hard to come by.
He's a lifetime friend, you know?
Exactly.
So this man who is insular, not comfortable with people, very few people can remember him laughing, spontaneously, all right? Not particularly comfortable on television, becomes president of the United States. I mean, how could that be?
Well, because one of the things that Nixon was completely focused on was politics. That Nixon prided himself on running his own campaigns. He had this very clear vision of what he wanted to do to get himself elected, and that he was, okay, this is going to come off badly. He was almost Stalin-esque in his narrow focus on accomplishing his goals, and his goals were always political and always achieved, frankly.
So in Nixon's presidency, what did he achieve?
Well, in his presidency, Nixon's probably took the most pride in his foreign policy accomplishments, some of which have some consequences that are increasingly negative over time, but at the time seemed very positive. Nixon is able to sign an arms control agreement with the Soviet Union, the first strategic arms limitation treaty, capping the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, limiting anti-ballistic missile systems. He increases trade with the Soviets, cultural exchanges, things of that nature. He, of course, is responsible for the opening to China, to communist China, begins the process of establishing relations with the People's Republic. The unfortunate side effect of this, though, is in so doing, he delegitimizes Taiwan, and the one China policy that Nixon helped force on Harry Truman sort of poisons the well for Taiwan going forward. Technically speaking, Nixon gets us out of Vietnam as slowly and painfully as possible, and as politically advantageously to himself as possible. He is also technically responsible for restoring relations with Egypt, although that's often more credited to Henry Kissinger. And a lot of the domestic gains of the presidency are really things that were instigated by Lyndon Johnson that just were carried out in his administration. Most of the improvements in civil rights that Nixon is sometimes given credit for grow out of the Johnson administration. That was my next line, but Nixon is technically responsible for creating the Environmental Protection Agency, the first clean air and clean water legislation. He doesn't really play any role in passing it, but he's happy to sign it and take credit for it.
And yet, this man, his career is built on ferreting out communists in the government. That's what the accusation Whitaker Chambers had against Alger Hiss was that Hiss had been a spy. They'd been fellow communists. He attacked Helen Gahagan Douglas for being pink, and et cetera. Yet he turns around and opens up doors to Red China and Red Russia. It doesn't seem to have much of political risk. It seemed to be generally supported by most people.
Well, there's sort of two things going on there. One is, and this sort of, I guess, speaks poorly of the United States more so than well of Richard Nixon, is that the trope that Richard Nixon is the only person who could open to communist China because Richard Nixon wouldn't be attacking him. So so there is that, but there's also the reality that a lot of the ferreting out of communists was mostly political in nature. That what is known as McCarthyism, although brutal at the local level, although brutal in the lives of some people, for Republican politicians like Richard Nixon, that's mostly about gaining power. That once Eisenhower had won the presidency, and once the Republicans regained control of Congress in the election of 1952, for most Republicans, the hunt was over.
Yeah.
We've accomplished what we were trying to accomplish, which is regaining control of the government. And so
and it takes Eisenhower about a year and a half to 2 years to encourage the Republican Senate to pull the trigger on Joe McCarthy.
Exactly, because McCarthy was perhaps the only Republican who didn't see things that way. That from Joe McCarthy's perspective, my power comes from this witch hunt, and so I'm not stopping just because my party happened to win power. To stay in the headlines, to stay in power myself, I'm continuing the hunt. Whereas most other Republicans were like, okay, problem solved, we're in control of the government.
Go back a minute to Nixon's foreign policy. Can you imagine another president with the ego of Nixon working with a man, the ego of Henry Kissinger?
Well, there are very few shrinking violets at the upper levels of the American government, ever. I mean, for all the stuff about Eisenhower and genial grandpa, he's got a massive ego and a massive temper. You don't get to be president if you don't have a giant ego. So you would need someone like that to deal with someone like Henry Kissinger.
And last week, or 2 weeks ago, my companion referred to Eisenhower as a hidden hand president.
Yes.
He behind the scenes, he had perfect timing, almost impeccable political timing about when to pull the trigger on somebody, when to support a policy, and if things didn't work out, somebody else usually got the blame.
Yeah.
Nixon, for example. One of the crises that Nixon mentions, the fourth one, I guess, was Eisenhower's illness, heart attack, I guess, in 1955. Did Nixon gain credence as a politician, as a leader, as a human being by the way he acted when Eisenhower was sick?
Yeah.
Is this a way other vice presidents follow now?
It does give him a significant amount of credit because many people feared that Nixon would be too assertive and would do the Al Haig, anachronistically speaking, I'm in charge kind of thing, which he very, very carefully did not. He made sure that he worked closely with John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, to run cabinet meetings, to make sure he wasn't being too forward, but was still showing everyone that the government was continuing to run. It is perhaps the best performance of Nixon's career in terms of no one finds any reason to find fault with him.
Right.
Democrats are impressed, Republicans are impressed. It is the model of how you handle this kind of crisis.
And this was before the 25th Amendment, so which had some guidelines on how a vice president is supposed to act in the incapacity of the presidency. I mean, it's happened, of course, George Bush with Reagan since then, for example. Okay.
Larry.
Yes?
So just a question to kind of follow up on that thread, and then we'll go back to some of the ones we've received. Doesn't that seem out of character for Nixon?
Does it have Nixon's actions as vice president seem out of character?
Well, no, actually, because Nixon was very well aware of protecting the reputation of Richard Nixon, that Nixon wanted to be seen as a safe choice going forward. Remember, if Eisenhower dies, not only does he become president, he's going to run as the head of the ticket in 1956. So he can't afford to alienate anybody at this point. Vice presidents aren't elected to do anything but
Be president.
backstop the president. So his behavior is essentially an audition, if not for 1956, then at least for 1960.
One other thing, Nixon must have known something about Eisenhower at this time, and he knew if he overstepped his bounds and Eisenhower came back, Nixon's toast.
Yeah, Nixon is very well aware that Eisenhower would be just fine without Nixon.
Yeah.
And Nixon will not survive without Eisenhower in
I
1957.
mean, all I can figure out is that Eisenhower was grooming somebody in Robert Anderson.
Yes.
Who was somewhere a sub-cabinet member.
Oh, he was Secretary of the Treasury.
As a replacement for Nixon. And again, he lets Nixon dangle for months before he finally says, oh, okay, you're on my ticket, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Eisenhower's right. Nixon has no experience leading anything, really. He's never in leading any sort of government agency or large-scale operation of any kind. But it's clearly would be a demotion. It would clearly be seen as Eisenhower not trusting him if he dropped him down into the cabinet.
Should Nixon have challenged the 1960 presidential election results?
No. In fact, some of his attorneys did start investigating some of the results, especially here in Illinois. And what they discovered was that although there are some questions about what happened in Chicago, there were also equally questions about what happened in Southern Illinois, the Republican part of the state, that wouldn't bear much scrutiny either. So it was not going to be worth the trouble for anybody.
Same question?
So there was a question about the 9,000 votes in Illinois, which I think you just addressed. So Jeff, let me know if we didn't get an answer for you on that question. And Lily is responding to the conversation about, we were talking about Nixon's, here, I'll just read it. I don't believe so. Consider his outward persona of being a man of principle and moral, as well as being a bigger man. Only Watergate really stripped that away.
Well,
Do you want to respond to that?
no. Watergate just sort of manifests the problems that Nixon has that he's largely able to control in public prior to this point. One of the realities is that Nixon's, as we started the conversation with, well of self-pity and conviction he's surrounded by enemies, leads him to take actions that are questionably legal throughout his career.
In the first election against Voorhees in California and against Hagen Douglas, he, as head of the party, head of the program for getting elected, countenanced at least false information being sent out, bogus information being sent out. Now, that's not unusual now, but in 1940 and 1950, that was pretty unusual.
His eventual White House Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, is fined during the 62 gubernatorial election for sending out information under the heading of the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. So he's engaged in this sort of questionable tactics throughout his career, but by and large is able to benefit from them mostly. There is also a lot of Me Tooism there is also a lot of whataboutism in Nixon's actions, that Nixon's default response whenever he's caught doing something is they did it first, and so I can do it.
One of the lines in the checkered speech is he refers to Pat Nixon as having a good Republican cloth coat. Because the charges were at the time there were people high-ranking in the Truman administration who would receive the urban and mink coats as bribes for action. Right?
Yeah.
The good Republican cloth coat.
Good Republican cloth coat, which embarrassed his wife.
Yes.
Nixon would actually every year celebrate the checkered speech. And every year, Pat Nixon was furiously angry and wouldn't talk to him the whole day. She hated that speech.
Anybody in the audience have a question?
Okay.
I've got some more.
Go.
No, even though,
Wait,
do you have a question?
Yes.
Sorry, the thread is growing here, which is good. How does the reaction of Nixon and his administrators to Watergate continue to influence his successors through to today's administration?
Well, how does Nixon's response to Watergate influence the way his successors behave? Well, first and foremost, no one's ever going to tape conversations in the White House ever again. Nixon felt comfortable doing so because up until his presidency, all presidential records were the personal property of the president, and there was no requirement that a president deposit them with the National Archives. And so that's right out the door to start with. Secondly, Nixon sort of gives a how both a how-to and a how not to tutorial on how to deal with this sort of thing. Nixon successfully stonewalls investigators for the better part of 2 years. And that has been the sort of standard operating procedure for subsequent presidents in crises, in investigations from Iran-Contra right through to this past year's impeachment. Stonewall, don't cooperate, attack the accuser. It becomes sort of the playbook for dealing with this. The primary unfortunate consequence of Nixon's Watergate is to make everything so hyper-partisan that even obvious illegal and unethical behaviors are going to be glossed or defended just to maintain party solidarity.
Let's go back to the taping for a minute. Nixon wasn't the first to tape, I guess.
No.
Roosevelt.
Truman inherited Roosevelt's, didn't really tape much. Eisenhower, Kennedy extensively, Johnson even more extensively.
But he doesn't put the taping system until like early 1971. He puts it in a couple of years.
Well, the story goes that Johnson left his taping system left it behind. Johnson was pretty open to taping. He had his secretary run the tapes. He mostly taped phone calls, rarely taped meetings. There is a story that he left the taping system in, that Nixon, who was mechanically incapable of operating a ballpoint pen, would try to tape something and instead kept pressing the button to call in the server for drinks, and so had it all taken out. And then increasingly distrusted Henry Kissinger and Kissinger's willingness to talk to the press and tell the press different things than he would tell Nixon. And so Nixon installs this system in February of '71 as a voice-activated system, so everything would automatically be taped. It was extremely high-tech for the time. This kind of voice-activated recording was incredibly rare and brand new at the time, and so was designed both to protect Nixon against his inability to operate a tape machine and against Henry Kissinger.
And as I recall, the taping system didn't require turning off and on. It was on all the time.
Well,
Nixon could have it turned off, right?
No, actually, because Nixon would wear something he would wear would trigger it that he was in the room. It wouldn't necessarily tape if someone else was in the room by themselves. It only taped where Nixon was in the room.
But it was also in the cabinet room, wasn't it? In a couple other places.
Yeah, it was in his office, the Oval Office, in his office in the Executive Office building, out at Camp David, his phones. So he taped most of the places he was going to be.
This might be a convenient place to start with Watergate. So you can start by telling us, what were the Pentagon Papers?
Well, the Pentagon Papers were a top secret Defense Department study undertaken by Johnson and Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. McNamara called for the study in 1967 and gathered all of the documents about Vietnam, primarily from the Johnson and Kennedy administrations, a little bit from Eisenhower and Truman. For what purpose was not entirely clear. He gathered all those documents. He had some of his aides begin analysis of these documents. He would claim later, so we could understand how we got to this point, but since he was one of the architects of the policy for the preceding 8 years, it's hard to believe he didn't know how we got to this point. My suspicion, never confirmed because he would never answer any questions that I sent him, was that he was doing it in case Robert Kennedy ran for presidency in 1968 and he was going to support Kennedy. And then he would then be able to try and help Robert deal with the question of, your brother wanted to instigate this policy, how can you run as an anti-war candidate?
But the vast amount of information gathered reflected on the Democratic presidents, his predecessors.
Yes.
Didn't reflect really much on Eisenhower.
No.
Certainly not on anything he had done.
Nope, nothing from the Nixon administration.
So why not let it go out?
Well, Nixon's knee-jerk reaction was to have a couple of aides start going through the papers themselves and start releasing information and embarrassing the Democrats. I mean, it's Henry Kissinger who comes to Nixon and points out, look, we are in the midst of secret talks with the North Vietnamese, we're in secret talks with the Chinese, we're in secret talks with the Soviets, and if they think we can't keep a secret, then what are we doing here? Then they might not trust us to continue these secret talks. Also, Kissinger correctly suspected one of his former aides had leaked the papers, and he didn't want any backsplash onto himself.
So when Daniel Ellsberg, who'd been part of the study,
Yep.
releases these papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think.
And the Boston
And the
Globe
Boston
and the
Globe,
LA
yeah.
Times, the St. Louis Post dispatch.
So the car's out of the garage. So what the response of Nixon is, dig his heels in, listen to Henry Kissinger, and somebody in his administration authorizes the break-in of Ellsberg's psychiatrist.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, Nixon was someone who did not like leaks. And so it is within his character and his past behaviors to attack the person leaking information out of the administration.
Hence the plumbers.
Hence the plumbers. And it's John Ehrlichman who gives the okay to this for Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and a handful of Cubans to go out and break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office because they couldn't come up with anything else to do to Ellsberg. They were going to prosecute him. But Nixon believed that was not enough, that you had to destroy him. You had to really make an example of Ellsberg, and the only way to do that would be to smash his reputation. But how would you do that in such a way that you could really hurt him? And so the decision was, well, if he's talking to a psychiatrist, he must have something embarrassing. Nixon had a lifelong phobia regarding psychiatrists, and so it sort of fit in with the for Ehrlichman et al. He's probably got embarrassing information that we can use against him.
To digress for a second, weren't there rumors that Nixon was seeking psychiatric help as vice president?
Nixon spoke to a guy who was technically a psychiatrist, but he saw him also as a GP. He didn't really seek psychiatric help, and he absolutely did not want anybody thinking he did. In fact, at one point during the 1968 election, one of the things that they had, those panel discussions, in lieu of actually speaking to people, his campaign team had him answer questions from a panel, and one of the panels, they were going to put a psychiatrist on it, and they said, absolutely not, Nixon hates psychiatrists, doesn't want anything to do with it. So find some other doctor.
We have a question.
Go ahead, Sue.
All right. So Jeff wants to know, after Agnew resigned, do you think Nixon made a deal with Ford to receive a pardon in return for Ford's selection?
No. I don't I think he saw Ford as the safest choice. That he knew if it came to impeachment, he was going to need Republican support in the House. That Ford was immensely popular as the minority leader in the House, and so this was sort of a way to curry favor with the eventual people who were going to vote on his impeachment. So Ford was just the safe choice. And Ford, for all his ham-fisted defense of Nixon throughout the next year, adamantly denied that he ever cut a deal. And Ford may be known for a lot of things, but dishonesty was never one of them.
Or major acuity either.
It's sort of unfair, but he's a savvy enough politician to get to the top of the heap in the Republican-controlled House.
And a very partisan Republican.
A very partisan Republican, somebody who wanted to impeach Justice William Douglas because Nixon wanted it done.
Yeah, and he says, what are the grounds? He said, well, they're pretty much whatever Congress decides the charges are going to be.
Which sounded good at the time.
Yeah, it did. Came back a little later, but haunted.
A little bit.
I'm struck by the. You have another question? No, I'm struck by the number of people around Nixon who are in his inner circle. Ehrlichman, Haldeman, John Dean, Dwight Chapin, people who they come from outside politics, and yet they're in the closest to the president. I mean, Ehrlichman had been a real estate attorney in Seattle.
Yes.
Haldeman was in real estate or housing or whatever you want to
I think it was in public relations.
I'd say public relations. And yet, I mean, where are the major political advisors to Nixon?
Well, Nixon thought of himself as the most intelligent politician in the country. He did choose people for political advice. He didn't feel that he needed it, which sort of reflects the difficulties he has getting things through Congress. He surrounded himself by people who would do what they were told and who were ruthless, frankly, and who would be unquestioningly loyal to Richard Nixon. That was the primary qualification you had to have.
So you've got a president who lives and eats and drinks politics, but who maybe has a sense of aggrievement about his life and his career, feels like he's an outsider, unloved, feels he's the best politician in the country, making crucial political mistakes. Right.
Yeah, yeah, but that's and therein lies the problem, that Nixon's unwillingness and oftentimes inability to accept advice comes back to haunt him. And it haunts him certainly in 1960 when he makes his ill-fated decision to campaign in all 50 states, which was dumb and unnecessary and stretched him far too thin. His conviction that, again, although he talked about how hard he worked and how much he worked with Congress, he really didn't like a lot of congressmen and didn't really invest enough time and effort into it. I mean, again, although the Democrats controlled Congress throughout his presidency, there are some things that they were willing to work with Nixon on that Nixon record is somewhat ambivalent. It's, Nixon proposes what sounds like a Democratic program in the Family Assistance Plan, would provide a basic minimum income for all Americans, but sees it as a political stunt and puts no time or effort into trying to get it passed, and so it never really goes anywhere. He gets the headlines and then doesn't have to deal with paying for the program.
Step rest from Watergate for a second. You brought up something called Southern strategy.
Okay.
Which is, as near as I can understand, was a decision made not originally by Nixon, but by others. Nixon carried it out to seek votes among conservative Southern Democrats who would work with a Republican, maybe even become Republican, as did Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, to shift the balance of power nationally. It worked, didn't it?
It did. What Nixon and the Republican Party, in a sense, get a gift from Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson successfully advocates for the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the moment after he signs it, as he's returning back to the White House, he turns to one of his aides and says, "I've just delivered the South to the Republican Party for your lifetime and mine." And he was absolutely correct. In the 1964 election, the historic landslide that Johnson wins, the biggest popular vote landslide in American history, he loses 6 states. He loses Barry Goldwater's Arizona by less than a percentage point, almost pulls that one off. And he loses 5 southern states that had voted Democratic in every election since Reconstruction, and catastrophically loses them. He loses in Mississippi, he gets less than 30% of the vote, and it's all because of civil rights. And so that opens the door for the Republicans to, frankly, take advantage of conservative white Southern opposition to civil rights to try and convert them to the Republican Party.
And then that strategy is delayed 4 years because of the rise of George Wallace, who runs in 68 as a third-party candidate, which carried the Goldwater Southern states,
Yes.
which made the election of 1968 closer than it should have been.
Yes and no, though, but because Wallace does carry those southern states, but he also does quite well in some northern cities. The beginnings of the northern backlash against civil rights starts to hit home in 1968, and working class whites in places like Detroit and Milwaukee are voting Wallace, and so it sort of becomes a cliche that Wallace hurts Nixon in 68. Wallace hurts Humphrey too. Humphrey loses Michigan because of this, because of those white voters who vote for Wallace. Humphrey loses what had been seen as a solid Union bastion in Michigan, and so it in fact in the long run helps the Republican Southern strategy to have Wallace there in 68. It becomes a transitional vote because many white Southern Democrats who vote for Wallace vote Democratic for Congress, and many of those people then vote Republican in 72. They are able to transition. If they could, in their minds, stop voting for the Democrats in 68 by voting for Wallace, it makes it that much easier to vote for Nixon in 72.
Yeah. Is there a place in Nixon's administration after the break-ins to Democratic National Headquarters, the Watergate, where Nixon crossed the Rubicon, or he, point of no return, where he couldn't salvage something by admitting the truth?
Well, it's really sort of day one. I mean, Nixon at no point in time seriously considered doing that. I sometimes tell my classes that the easiest point to solve a problem is the earliest point that you realize you have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so the day that Nixon could have solved this problem was really June 20th, when he allegedly first finds out about the break-in. That's the point at which he could have said, well, these guys acted on their own. That was a believable argument in June of 1972. This sort of a weird, wacky story. The Cubans breaking in. Liddy's a fanatic. Hunt's ex-CIA, who writes spy novels. It's a perfect way to blow this off is to do it right off the bat. The second Nixon hears about this, though, his response is to cover up. And so there's no point where that's a viable strategy in the mind of Richard Nixon.
Is that the June 20 tape of the 18.5 minutes?
Yes.
Erased out of it?
Yes. And the June 23rd tape is the smoking gun. The June 20th tape is the first discussion. And there's never serious consideration given to anything but covering up.
So back up a little bit. Before the Watergate break-in, the Nixon administration was already concerned about leaks. They had already formed the plumbers.
Yes.
John Mitchell, who is still sitting as Attorney General before he becomes Nixon's campaign manager in 72,
In name only.
sits at a meeting where they discuss something called Operation Gemstone, which
This
is
is at 3 meetings we discussed Operation Gemstone. The Operation Gemstone was the plan put forward by Gordon Liddy to undertake a series of operations against the Democrats in 1972. Before we get to Operation Gemstone, what you have to keep in mind is that throughout 1971, Richard Nixon looks like a one-term president. He is polling behind all of the front-running Democrats. He's polling behind Evan Muskie, he's polling behind Hubert Humphrey, he's polling behind candidates who aren't even running in 1972. So one of the most common straw man arguments is Nixon didn't need any landslide victory. Yeah, he did need it. He had no idea how things were going to turn out. These plans are being formulated under the belief that Nixon's election is in doubt. So Gemstone is this idea that Liddy comes up with and puts forward to Mitchell and et al. And calls for things like breaking into Democratic National Headquarters and tapping their phones and photographing documents. He also calls for hiring prostitutes and taking them down to the Democratic National Convention and blackmailing Democratic officials, kidnapping prominent anti-war activists and taking them to Mexico during the Republican National Convention, bugging the candidate's plane or flying a plane behind the Democratic candidate's plane to monitor their transmissions, all kinds of expensive things, $1 million plan. And Mitchell's response is not, well, oh, this is illegal. It's too expensive. Pare this down. So he cuts it to $500,000 for the second meeting. And by the third meeting, it's focused on intelligence gathering. And it's down to $250,000, and that's the one that gets approved.
Where does Howard Hughes fit into this?
Well, Howard Hughes had loaned Nixon money. He'd loaned Nixon's brother a lot of money. Donald Nixon. He'd also employed the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Larry O'Brien, as a retainer. Nixon thought that he could use that against O'Brien, but O'Brien reported it on his taxes. Nixon had the IRS look into it twice and said, nope, he reported it. We have nothing on him. Nixon was afraid that this would be brought up in the campaign, that this was one of the things that they were going through documents for the National Committee headquarters, what kind of tax they were going to use against Nixon personally.
So it's preventive warfare in a
In a
sense.
sense, yeah. That, you know,
Stealing a march on the enemy.
now, but you have to put it in the context of what the Republicans were doing. That the committee to re-elect the president, in addition to Operation Gemstone, were operating some very successful dirty tricks campaigns against the Democrats. They were pulling stuff on Humphrey and Muskie and John Lindsay, but not George McGovern, because they considered McGovern the weakest link. And so we're looking to undercut all of these other campaigns. They had intelligence operatives in Muskie's campaign, in McGovern's campaign, in Humphrey's campaign, and we're looking successfully to turn the Democrats against each other, and to try and guarantee that the weakest candidate would get nominated. And lo and behold, he did.
Yes, actually they did. Even though McGovern had been sort of a war hero in World War II as a bomber pilot in Italy, had then been decorated for it, you never heard that in the campaign.
Oh, no. One of the other things to keep in mind, not to give all the credit to the dirty tricks campaign of the Republicans, that McGovern helped create the system under which he won the nomination. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey got the nomination despite not contesting any primaries. He got all the delegates in the non-primary states, which was enough to get the nomination. So the Democrats rewrote the rules to require primaries and caucuses, to have more inclusive
Delegates
delegations.
in the convention, yeah.
And McGovern helped write them. He was on the committee that wrote the rules and took advantage of them.
Thomas Eagleton is vice president,
And then
who's been under psychiatric care.
And then throws it the whole way. Well, that's sort of a last minute choice, though. He really wanted and expected to get Teddy Kennedy,
Right.
and Kennedy sort of strung him along to the last minute and then said, no, Kennedy's not going to run for vice president.
Anything, Sue?
Any questions from the audience?
Okay. Now let's get into Watergate.
Okay.
If there had been no taping system, does Nixon resign as president?
It's a lot harder. It's a lot harder because it becomes a lot more about who you believe. I think it's a lot harder to get him to resign, and it's a lot harder to turn Republicans in Congress against him to the point where he feels he has no choice but to resign.
And when the Supreme Court rules 8-0 in U.S. versus Nixon, he's got to turn the subpoenaed smoking gun tape over.
Yes.
That doesn't. He knows that smoking gun tape exists.
Yes.
And is there any question that he was involved in the 18-minute gap?
Oh, there's no question at all. He is absolutely the person who had the motive, the opportunity, and the lack of expertise to so ham-fistedly do it. It's 5 separate erasures. The best that we can figure is that he checked this tape out. We know he did. He was one of only 2 or 3 people that had access to the tapes. He tried to erase the section on Watergate. He found out how difficult it was going to be. And instead of going through and erasing tapes, he decided to fight it, to fight releasing them, to claim executive privilege, to go to court, to try to fire the special prosecutor, anything to hold on to the tapes.
I remember when, before he released all the tapes, he released the transcripts of a bunch of them.
Yeah, well,
Big book, you know?
yeah, that was actually one of the things I talked about in my Wallace lecture, that Nixon did give up some tapes in the fall of '73 after the firing of the special prosecutor backfired on him so badly. The new special prosecutor and the House Judiciary Committee subpoenaed more tapes, and this time they're just like, no more tapes. I've given enough tapes. Here's what I'll do instead. Me and my staff will transcribe these tapes, and this is all you're getting. And as one historian pointed out at the time, these transcripts are completely worthless, not just as a matter of in court, but they're completely unbelievable that for hours and hours the tapes work perfectly fine. And then you get to the section about Watergate and everything's unintelligible.
Yeah. Expletive
deleted. Yes.
I remember people responding who read those tapes, prominent religious figures, saying, well, that doesn't prove anything, but I'm really shocked at the language used in the presidential office. I should have heard Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, look, I mean, as someone who hates censoring anything, that always frustrates me. It's like, look, the man was in the Navy, and he's under an immense amount of pressure. I would be more concerned if he didn't swear. I would find that less believable. Yeah, I mean, Kennedy does, Johnson does, Eisenhower's vocabulary is a career soldier. This is not surprising, and I find that somewhat kind of okay, this is going to sound terrible too. As traditionally American hypocrisy about morality, that swearing is shocking. Yeah, no, not really. Let's focus on what's actually shocking. That is the president's engaging in illegal activity.
So if the Senate Watergate Committee doesn't subpoena Alexander Butterfield.
Well, there's no doubt they're going to have to subpoena Alexander Butterfield. He's Haldeman's Haldeman. He's Haldeman's chief of staff. He controls Nixon's schedule. And so he one of the things that the Senate committee was trying to do was create a background understanding of Nixon's day that most people don't know anything about. Most people only see Nixon on television or in the newspaper once in a while. And so you have to subpoena Butterfield. What so shocked Nixon was that Butterfield told the truth. That we expected that Butterfield, the only one or two people that knew about the taping system that were going to talk to the Senate committee would just claim executive privilege rather than acknowledge this sort of thing. But Butterfield was an honorable man, and he was under oath and got a direct question that he couldn't evade. He evaded the first question. The Democratic counsel asked him about a verbatim transcript and said, well, does Nixon have a note taker? And Butterfield said, no, he's got this phenomenal memory. He doesn't have it, sort of thing. Well, then how can you explain this transcript? And Butterfield kind of ducked it and said, well, I have to think about that. And the Democratic counsel doesn't follow up. The Republican counsel comes in next. And again, they're all in the room at the same time. It's not like the Democrats all left. But the Republican counsel says, all right, well, following up on that question, is the president taping? Is he recording his meetings? And Butterfield's answer to that question sort of gives away the game. His answer to the question is, am I under oath?
And you are?
You are, and so yes. And then he indicates the extent of the taping system. And for once, the Senate committee didn't leak until Butterfield was questioned in public.
Did not, that's true. My wife was recuperating from surgery, and we lived on a third floor apartment. She couldn't go up down steps to the summer of the Watergate hearings. So every day I'd come home from work and she'd give me almost blow by blow, and she said, I can't believe it, they take the conversations, And you could see the handwriting on the wall then. Let's go to the Watergate Committee for a minute. Can you imagine circumstances previous or since American history that would make an heroic figure out of an essentially racist, conservative North Carolina senator like Sam Murray?
Well, sure. I mean, that's the 19th century. I mean, yeah.
But in this century, the 20th century?
Well, that's Richard Russell. And, Irvin was both things. One of the things to keep in mind is that nobody's perfect and nobody's one thing or the other. Irvin was a consistent vote against civil rights.
He was a constitutional scholar.
He was a constitutional scholar, but he was a constitutional scholar who used that scholarship to block civil rights legislation and to lobby against it. But in this situation, that actually makes him the perfect choice to chair this committee because of the direction that southern states are going in terms of supporting Republicans. Irvin supported a lot of the foreign policy stuff that Nixon put forward. He voted for some of the domestic stuff that Nixon supported. So although he is a partisan Democrat, he is seen as a safe choice by the Republicans to give the committee the gravitas and make it sort of bipartisan and fair.
And then when he gets in the committee and he hears the testimony, he sees the record, it rankles his what can I say, consistent support of freedom of speech.
Well, freedom of speech, he is angered by the lying. He's angered by the contempt for the Constitution that some of Nixon's aides and especially a couple of Nixon's lawyers show throughout the questioning, and it turns him into an advocate for ferreting out the truth about Richard Nixon and for supporting supporting the special prosecutor and supporting impeachment.
And it's a pretty strong staff committee. Sam Dash, Fred Thompson on the Republican side.
It is a well set up committee. You have liberal Republican Weicker. You have
Edward Gurney, conservative.
So he becomes sort of the surrogate for Nixon. You have Howard Baker, who falls somewhere in the middle, who actually is a good bellwether for how this goes. As he comes in adamantly pro-Nixon, and by the end of the hearings is adamantly not.
What did the president know? When did he know?
Which he thought was going to be an exonerating question, and it turned out to be a damning one.
The interesting person in that committee was Herman Talmadge. Now, I'm a Southern historian. Talmadge was well known in Georgia as a womanizer, a drunk, and a demagogue. And yet, for about 6 months, he does his homework and he asks intelligent follow-up questions, most surprisingly.
Well, again, this is part of the solid staff work that the committee had, that people like Sam Dash knows who to funnel questions to. And Talmadge did clean up his act, at least for a while, and was a credit to the committee.
Anything, Sue?
Anybody here?
Okay, let's keep on with this. Now, what's the entity that got Nixon? Is it Judge Sirica? Is it the impeachment process? Is it the special prosecutor, or is it the Watergate Committee?
I think it's a little bit of all of them. I think Sirica's role is crucial because, like Ervin, he is a very conservative, and unlike Ervin, a very conservative Republican.
Yeah.
Sirica is appointed to the bench by Eisenhower. He is known as Maximum John Sirica, as a real hanging judge who is not known as a constitutional fireling, who is considered to be a very hardline jurist who, like Ervin, is offended by the open dishonesty that's going on in this court. Now, the thing that Sirica does that helps break this wide open is something that is questionably constitutional. Sirica had done this before, and had been attacked by the ACLU for doing this before. When the first Watergate trial was over, and Liddy and Hunt and James McCord and the four Cubans and Barker were all convicted, what he did was give them all provisional maximum sentences, which is to say that they would get the maximum possible sentence for this crime unless they agreed to cooperate with the Senate Select Committee and eventually also with the special prosecutor. And again, it's kind of a borderline unconstitutional move, but it works. McCord does not want to go to jail. He felt he had been promised clemency. He felt he was double-crossed. He felt that Nixon was trying to throw this off of the CIA, which was his home institution and something he deeply loved. And so he writes the letter to Sirica saying that people have perjured themselves. I'm willing to cooperate with the Senate committee. I'm willing to answer more questions. And that implicates John Dean. That puts Dean in the line of fire, and Dean is going to start looking for an attorney.
At the same time they're doing this, Nixon administration is beginning to pay hush money to the
Wow, I'm kidding. They've been paying hush money.
That's right. And in fact, is E. Howard Hunt's, is it his wife? It's Hunt's wife.
It's Hunt's wife.
In a plane crash
In December.
It finds like $30,000 in cash.
Yes, she was carrying hush money. And so they've been paying hush money with Dorothy Hunt's death. One of the conduits was gone. Hunt was making more and more demands for more and more money because now his wife was gone. He needed more money to take care of his family. One of his children was developmentally disabled, and so Nixon really didn't see much of a choice but to just pay Hunt off.
Nixon knew about the hush money. He authorized it.
He did. He directly authorized it. In fact, when one of the cancer on the presidency meeting between Dean and Nixon, one of the things that strikes Dean about this meeting is how much Nixon knows. Dean thinks he's going in here with new information, fresh information that the president is unavailed of up to this point. And he discovers that Nixon, without prompting, knows the code name Gemstone. Nixon knows about the hush money. Nixon knows about other break-ins, that Nixon's almost as well informed, and in some cases better informed than Dean. And when Dean says, well, when Nixon asks him, how much is it gonna take? Dean reaches for a number he thinks will be shocking and says, well, at least $1 million, and Nixon's response is, we can get that.
We can find that.
We can get $1 million.
Again, he was so concerned about winning re-election in 1972, he cast a very wide net for money, had more money on hand after the election than he knew what to do with.
Well, he knew what to do with it.
Yeah, but I mean,
it was the most expensive campaign at that point in American history. Nixon took full advantage, violated the new campaign finance laws and got as much money as possible and ran an independent campaign. As part of the problem, he runs the committee to re-elect the president separate from the Republican Party and does literally nothing to help the Republican Party throughout 1972, which is why he is the only president to date in American history who wins 2 terms but never has his party control either House of Congress. And so, but Nixon thought going into this that he had won this massive landslide and he was now going to reorganize the government, and he didn't really care what Congress thought.
So the acquiescence, he would prefer to say that he encouraged the appointment of an independent counsel, or what do you call it?
Special prosecutor.
Special prosecutor. And they picked Archibald Cox, who had been the Solicitor General in the Kennedy administration. Isn't that right?
He was a Solicitor General of the Kennedy administration, but he was also a professor at Harvard Law. He also was well respected within the legal community. So initially, Nixon's response is, well, fine. He's fairly conservative, fine. I know he's got this Kennedy connection, but in those days, the number 2 man in the Justice Department wasn't necessarily a partisan. He was a professional.
So his assumption was, even though you acquiesced to the appointment of a pretty widely known Democrat, that the defense is going to be, well, the courts will never sustain subpoenas for presidential documents, okay?
They won't sustain subpoenas for presidential documents. They don't know about the taping system. Some of these guys are still willing to perjure themselves and claim that there were no higher ups involved. And so it becomes a he said situation, that if Liddy and Hunt will keep their mouths shut, McCord has no proof. He asked Dean to write a report that essentially exonerates everybody, and we can still get out of this.
By the way, explain to me, Dean was a counsel to the president. What does a counsel to the president do?
Dean was essentially a low-level attorney handling White House legal matters. And what he did over the course of his first year and a half in the job was handle any legal matters that he could get his hand on. One of the first things he did was investigate a guy who was a Nixon impersonator. A fly-by-night magazine that wrote a satire about Nixon. They investigated, they paid their taxes. He would handle White House staff's tax issues and any legal questions. So he built up a clientele besides the president within the executive branch, so that he would be the person to turn to for legal advice, and possibly move closer to the president. Because although on paper he's the president's legal counsel, he really doesn't talk to Nixon very much for the first year and a half he's there. He's just a lawyer on the staff.
So legal counsel doesn't necessarily mean the counsel's getting legal advice from the president. He's a lawyer serving on the president's staff.
Right.
His duties as assigned.
Exactly. And it's only after he starts to show that he can handle these kinds of things and has that streak of ruthlessness in him that he starts getting more and more work closer and closer to the president. Gets trusted by Haldeman, gets trusted by Ehrlichman, and thus gets access to the corridors of power.
So when Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox persists in pushing subpoenas, Nixon fires him. The Saturday Night Massacre.
Yes.
Can you think of a previous similar situation in the history of the presidency?
Not really, no. I mean, it's not only a unique situation, but it's a uniquely stupid political move by a political expert. I mean, the Nixon's line of thought appears to be that the Democrats got Agnew, and so now I get to get rid of the special prosecutor. They got one of mine, so I get one of theirs.
It's interesting. only in the backdrop of Watergate, with the fact that the sitting vice president pleads no contest to bribery, another vice president without an election, that vice president becomes president when the previous president resigns, and you got a third vice president named without another election in the space of a year and a half. I mean,
well, again, it sort of speaks to the actual role of the vice presidency
Yeah, it
in
does.
the government. It's an interchangeable job. But yeah, I mean, Spiro Agnew's very real crimes become sort of a footnote to all of this. Agnew had been taking bribes throughout a lot of his career.
For
When he was mayor of Baltimore, executive head of the county executive in Baltimore County, governor of Maryland, at least through the first several months he was in the vice presidency, he was still taking bribes. So, you know, he's pretty openly a crook, and is forgotten. Is sort of
the footnote.
he's a footnote, yeah. In a negative sense.
And then, what, a week or two later, we've got an international crisis, an outbreak of the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. Is that the first time that people around Nixon became concerned about his stability and decision-making?
Officially, yes. Kissinger apparently would refer to him as my drunken friend to some of his staff, but it's the first time where Nixon's clearly not in charge, where Kissinger's actually, the Yom Kippur actually happens before Saturday Night Massacre. Kissinger leaves the country flies to Moscow and begins what becomes shuttle diplomacy, and he calls back to DC to tell Nixon what's going on, and he's told, well, we got our own problems here. And he goes, well, what the hell could be happening in Washington on a Saturday night? And they tell him about the Saturday Night Massacre and the response, because Kissinger realized, aha, I'm now a free agent. I can do what I want here. And so he's going to cut the Soviets out of the diplomacy and spend his time in the Middle East cutting a deal, getting a ceasefire, having that ceasefire fall apart, getting a second ceasefire, disengaging the Israeli and Egyptian armies, all on his own dime, and paying lip service that the president knows what he's doing.
Interesting, this Saturday Night Massacre, back to that for a second. It had political ramifications nobody could think about. First of all, Nixon tells the Attorney General to fire the fluffy. He refuses. And Ellie Richardson resigns.
Yep.
The next person is Donald Rumsfeld. He resigns. He refuses to do it. The third person in line is Robert Bork, who follows orders and will never become a Supreme Court justice because of that.
Yeah, but I mean, in theory, you could see the line of thinking, though. Richardson had promised the Senate, when they approved him as Attorney General, that unless Cox committed some sort of malfeasance, he was going to keep him in the job. And so he was keeping his word. Ruckelshaus had agreed with Richardson that there was no need to fire him, and it was questionable whether or not he could fire him as this sort of acting Attorney General. And so Ruckelshaus resigns, and Bork was encouraged by Ruckelshaus and Richardson to stay on, not resign. So there's some continuity in the Justice Department. And Bork, from his perspective, I didn't make any promises not to fire this guy, so I'm going to fire the guy. And so, you know, there's no way to know that that's going to have consequences coming up the road for him later in his career. But it did.
Now, let's go forward a little bit to the impeachment process. We've just gone through one a couple of years ago. This one was aborted, but there's no doubt that Nixon would have been found guilty when the House voted.
Absolutely.
And he was aware of it.
Yes.
And Barry Goldwater told him, I think, among other people.
When
Scott.
When the impeachment, the House Judiciary Committee voted on the articles of impeachment, the first two had bipartisan support. The votes were 27 to 11 and 28 to 10. The third article was party line 21-17. But when the smoking gun tape came out, when several of the ones who voted no on the articles said they would vote yes for impeachment, because now there was evidence. There was evidence before, don't get me wrong, but now there's evidence that they were willing to use to justify a vote to impeach Richard Nixon.
So there was a group of bipartisan congressmen of both parties. It included 3 Southern Democrats whose districts, I think, had been carried by Wallace in 68 and Nixon in 72.
Yes. Nixon,
Walter
yeah.
Flowers and James Mann and
Caldwell Butler.
And they made, I'm not even sure, the instigation was natively Tom Railsback, who was at that time our congressman from the Quad Cities.
Yep.
And they called themselves a fragile coalition.
They didn't call themselves
Somebody
fragile.
else did.
Somebody else called them that, and it angered them immensely.
Yes.
They said, we don't feel fragile. It was just this coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans who, in a very real sense, were used to being the dominant force in Congress and had been throughout the 50s and 60s. So it's a natural coalition in that sense. And it represents the group that you had to convince if this was not going to be Andrew Johnson all over again, if this was not going to be just a partisan attack and successfully portrayed as one. And it's somewhat problematic in the long run, though, because one of the unfortunate realities that come out of this is there's a lot of self-congratulation in 1974. When Nixon resigns, there's a lot of people patting themselves on the back saying the system worked, everything's fine. And it's like, sort of, but it took the better part of 2 years, and it just so happened that Nixon provided evidence that was so completely unimpeachable that even hardcore partisans like Charles Wiggins from California were going to have to vote against Richard Nixon. And the lesson that seems to have been learned, part of the lesson that seems to have been learned, is don't let it get to that point. Just make it partisan.
Get it done.
I mean by the people who are being impeached.
Oh, yes.
That the president's
Makes it partisan.
is always portrayed as partisan. Don't worry about what the evidence is. Just make it a partisan fight and rally the troops to the cause. And unfortunately, that's how things have gone since then. That even in the face of evidence, the presiding question is he from my party or not?
Oh, by the way, the Tom Railsback papers are in Westerns.
They are.
Have you ever seen them?
I have not had a chance to work with them yet.
I don't know anybody who did that.
In fact, one of our teaching support assistants, Riley Gover, is working with them right now.
Well, I was, years ago before he was famous, on a panel with Railsback before Watergate. And he was very low-key, very soft-spoken, didn't seem to have any strong opinions about anything. And I mean, there was something here that caught his mind. I mean, there was just a sense of wrong, this is wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the idea that Nixon engaged in clearly illegal activity. He and his staff thought of themselves as being above the law, lied about it, covered it up, and got caught. One of the positive things about Watergate is how many people said, all right, normally I would not think this would be possible for me to want to impeach Richard Nixon, but my sense of justice is offended, that he does not have the right to go out and break the law just because he's president.
So it's clear, even among constitutional scholars, that the three charges, particularly the first two, obstruction of justice and abuse of power, are impeachable offenses.
Yes.
And there's no question about that.
No.
It's not like Andrew Johnson violating a law that may have been unconstitutional.
Constitutional in the first place.
Yeah, and was set up pretty much to trap him anyway, which
Yes.
he walked right into. So the process worked in sense, even though it took a couple of years, even though you and I now know, as almost an historian who studied this, that from the get-go, Nixon had done wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, but it took the process to work that way.
Right.
Is there any conceivable way Nixon would have resigned before the House, the impeachment committee met and the Supreme Court decision decided 8-0?
No, there was talk about it. He talked about it with Amy, but his instinct, his traditional instinct was just to fight it. And it's only when it became clear that he would be not just humiliated by being removed from office, but would lose all the perks of being an ex-president. You lose the pension, you lose the Secret Service protection, you lose free office space, everything, and potentially are open to being prosecuted. That he he gives up and quits.
Did Ford do the right thing in pardoning him?
No.
Go ahead.
Politically, it's the right thing for him in the sense that he threw himself on a sword for the Republican Party. He cost himself the presidency, but he exorcises the ghost of Richard Nixon so that a Republican can be elected president in 1980. But he sort of reinforces the idea that the president is not subject to the same the same level of legal liability as everybody else. Now, Ford himself would disagree with me. Ford himself carried in his pocket to the day he died the law that states that if you accept a pardon, you are acknowledging that you've committed a crime. And so that was his fallback. If people complain, he would pull this out and say, yeah, but Nixon, by taking this pardon, is acknowledging that he in fact broke the law. But that's kind of thin sauce to undertake this kind of behavior.
And it is apparently true that Haldeman called Nixon's office a few days before Nixon resigned.
It has to be pardoned.
It has to be pardoned in Nixon. I'm not sure he talked to Nixon. He may have talked to his chief of staff.
He did talk to L. Haig, and I believe he did also talk to Nixon, but Nixon was concerned about his own liability at that point.
So Woodward and Bernstein did not bring Nixon down.
No, they do, however, help in terms of making this what was seen as an insular Washington scandal explainable to the general public. They do by keeping it this issue in the headline at least through October of '72. What's often forgotten is a lot of these stories go away until after Election Day then, for the end of October, first part of November. But it explained some of these activities in a way that you can understand that they're crimes, and you can understand that they're unusual behavior, that it's not just politicians being politicians.
The book comes out in like June of '74. By that time, Nixon is pretty much on his last legs. I'm not sure how many people read the book, but a lot of people saw the movie that was made in
I would think more so than they read the book.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking, when you've got Robert Redford playing,
Yeah, I know. Woodward Burns. There's a story. The screenwriter of the movie, William Goldman, regretted writing the movie for the rest of his life. He enjoyed doing it, but he had so many problems with Bernstein, who was dating Nora Ephron at the time and wrote his own script.
Yeah.
And Redford was writing his own script, and Goldman's like, yeah, I'd do it my whole life over. I would, Oscar or not, I wouldn't write this movie.
Now, with the internet and everything else going on, that kind of journalistic expose is pretty well past, don't you think?
No, actually, I don't think so. I think
You think it's somebody from the newspaper is going to run with this?
I think that you can, but you have to do it in the context of everything else. What's different now is that the field is so much wider that it's not enough just to publish in the newspaper. You're going to have to follow up with the online presence of your newspaper, and you're going to have to get it on television, and it's a lot harder. It can be done, but it's going to require a lot more action. And of course, debunking people who are going to lie about it when online. Because
So of the people who went to jail, 40-something, 43, something like that, did any of them not deserve it?
no,
Everyone either pleaded guilty or found themselves guilty.
Yep.
Had been involved.
yes,
There's no collateral damage here.
no. Maurice Stans whines a lot, but no, he was guilty too.
Sure, he owns longer money, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He spent the rest of his life. He was convicted and then spent the rest of his life saying, "I never thought I did anything wrong." Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
You did. This is one sense where the only person who doesn't go to jail, who just probably deserved to, was Nixon.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to do one last question. Is that about the right time for you?
Yep, just about right.
All you know about the American presidency. Where would you rank Nixon as president?
In the bottom five. I mean,
Well, with Andrew Johnson and people like that?
yeah, I mean, the problem with Nixon is that Watergate is so grievously bad, so egregiously bad that it undercuts the positive things that happened during his presidency. He's not responsible for some of the positive things. He is responsible for some of them. He is, especially in terms of foreign policy. But Watergate is so egregious that it undercuts everything else.
Could Nixon have been a great president? With his
No.
personality and his background?
He is smart enough to be, he's politically savvy enough to be. Eisenhower's right, though. He's a terrible manager. He's not a good people person. He's not good. He's not a good judge of character. He's too dependent on loyalty as the primary virtue when he's hiring somebody. So I think at best he's a middle of the pack president.
When I think of really successful presidents, a couple of exceptions. I think of somebody who really enjoys being president. That is, he maybe not enjoys the deity of grudging, but he likes the decision-making process and the feeling when something works and that sort of thing.
And someone who is able to bring out the best in people and who's able to work, to delegate effectively and to work with the other branches of government. I mean, ultimately, the best presidents are the ones that are able to get enough of their program through Congress and to get enough of the people to support their programs to succeed for everybody, or for almost everybody.
Is there any way that Nixon can, in succeeding generations, can be rectified, his reputation can be resumed?
The Nixon Foundation has been working on this since the moment he resigned. Frankly, unless you have a president who actually commits murder in the White House, you're going to have a hard time replicating this. I mean, other presidents commit illegal acts, including the current president. But Nixon is unique in the sense that he not only commits these illegal activities, he leaves behind a clear and concise record of those activities that demonstrably prove that he and his aides are guilty of those activities. And you're going to have a hard time reaching that level of proof and not having things sink into a morass of partisanship.
You've seen the movie Nixon, have you not?
I have some of it. I don't like Oliver Stone. I don't like his movies. The movie Nixon is a problem because John Ehrlichman threatened to sue him, so he presents Ehrlichman as a hero when he definitely is not.
I think, Sue, we are finished.
I think we lost the sound. You guys just talked too much, so we'll say bye, good night.
Good night, everybody.
Okay, so I can't talk about the next 2 weeks?
No, I think, well, we could, if you want me to try to get this back on, we are still live.
You're gonna
I'll put it in the comments.
Yeah.
So, let me